I have been an emissary of the Cathari Compact for 22 years. I have delivered formal challenges to warlords. I have sat across negotiating tables from beings who wore their threat the way some species wear ceremonial armor, deliberately, loudly, as argument. I have been present in chambers where the outcome of a single misread gesture meant the deaths of hundreds of thousands. I have read threat in every form my training encompasses. I did not read Elias Cormac correctly for the first 4 hours. That is the thing I am most reluctant to include in this document. My instructions are to be complete and accurate, so I include it. The assignment came through the Compact's third diplomatic house. The Dominance Pact had begun its push along the Kethai's corridor, 3 systems in 18 months, absorbed with the clinical efficiency of a species that had simply stopped asking permission. The Compact's War Council had run the engagement projections. The numbers were not favorable. We needed an ally with credibility in that corridor, with force multiplication that could make the Pact reconsider its math. The question, as the House Lord framed it, was simple. Which species, presented with the right overture, would actually show up? The answer that came back, from every strategic analyst the House employed, was Earth. The analysis was thorough. Earth humans held 3 systems in the Kethai's corridor outright and had transit arrangements across 2 more. Their frontier engagement doctrine was well documented across 40 years of corridor history. When they committed to a corridor, they held it. When something moved against a human-aligned installation, the response was not proportional. The analysts used the phrase structurally disproportionate. The War Council found this encouraging. I was briefed on Earth's classification before I departed. The Galactic Standard Registry lists Earth as Class 12. The Human Registry uses its own internal taxonomy, which the Compact's analysts had cross-referenced. The conversion does not produce a clean number. The analyst's note at the bottom of the conversion table was the first thing that caught my attention. The discrepancy arises because the Galactic Standard Scale was calibrated against observed Deathworlds prior to the formal cataloging of Earth. The Galactic Scale has not been retroactively adjusted. Earth's internal classification of Class 16 is considered the more accurate descriptor by the species that produced it. I read that note 3 times before I filed the briefing packet. I had worked with human personnel on 2 prior assignments. I had found them competent and professionally reliable, and notably difficult to read through the standard effective status indicators that most species project with reasonable legibility. I had attributed this to cultural variance. I was revising that attribution. The House Lord gave me a straightforward directive. Find the finest warrior Earth could place at the table, not a politician, not a diplomat. A warrior in the Cathari sense, someone whose history spoke before they did, someone a War Council would look at and understand immediately. We were not asking for a treaty. We were proposing a bond of mutual honor, the kind the Compact only extends to those it considers peers in the hierarchy of force. We wanted to seat a peer. The Human Settlement Coordinator on Kethai's colony gave me an address without hesitation. No ceremony. No consultation. He looked at my question, looked at a terminal, and gave me grid coordinates. He held my gaze for a moment afterward, and I noted the particular quality of that hold, the flat assessment of a being deciding whether the person across from it needed more information. He decided I didn't, apparently. He turned back to his terminal. The coordinates resolved to a farmstead 11 kilometers outside the colony's primary settlement. I verified them twice. I consulted the colony's civilian registry. The name attached to the grid coordinates was Elias Cormac, age 63. Occupation listed as agricultural mixed cultivation, some livestock. No military designation. No active service notation. The registry noted a prior service record but flagged it as sealed under the colony's civilian reintegration compact. I could see that there was a record. I could not see what was in it. I consulted my cultural brief on Earth humans and sealed military records. The brief said that certain service designations were routinely sealed at a veteran's request, and that this was more common the longer and more specific the service had been. It was not a bureaucratic anomaly. It was, if anything, a pattern. The brief also noted, in a sidebar I had not previously weighted, that Earth humans do not typically discuss the nature of sealed records, and that requests for clarification are generally received as a social error of moderate significance. I noted this, I filed it, I went anyway. The access road to the farmstead was unpaved. My transport settled in a dust clearing that passed for a landing pad. There was a low fence line, locally sourced timber, weathered gray, functional rather than decorative. Fields on 3 sides, one plowed and seeded in rows, one fallow, one showing the green of something already coming up. A structure at the end of a short track that the colonial architecture catalog in my cultural brief identified as a farmhouse, modest by any standard. A covered porch, a single outbuilding set at an angle to the east. I walked the track. The air was warm. Kethai's colony sits in a temperate zone with a growing season that functions for most Earth cultivars without much modification. I had read this in the colony's intake documentation. It smelled of upturned soil, and something I did not have a reference for, a particular green sharpness that I would later learn was the foliage of whatever was growing in the near field. There were sounds from the livestock pen, something vocal, something with hooves. There was the sound of work being done somewhere on the property. There was a man in the near field. He was on his knees in the mud between 2 rows, working with a short-handled tool, pressing something into the loosened earth at intervals of what looked like a hand's width. He wore worn trousers and a long-sleeved shirt with the cuffs rolled to the elbows, work boots caked with clay, a brimmed hat of the style the cultural brief described as common for sun protection in agricultural contexts. He did not look up when my transport arrived. He did not look up as I walked the track. He was, as far as I could tell, placing small bulbs in a row, and he was doing it with the complete focus of a being that had found the task entirely sufficient. I stopped at the fence line. I waited. He finished the section he was working. He sat back on his heels, evaluated the row, then stood carefully, one knee at a time, with the deliberate economy of someone managing a body that had opinions about the motion. He turned and saw me. He had the kind of face that has been outside for decades, weathered, deeply lined, brown from sun exposure. Gray hair cut short under the hat. He was not a large man. He was of average height for an Earth human male, perhaps slightly below. His frame was lean rather than imposing. His hands, I noticed when he pulled off a work glove, were the hands of someone who had done physical labor for a long time, scarred, knuckled, thick through the palm, but not uniformly scarred in the way of farming. The scarring distributed in patterns that farming does not produce. He walked toward me with no particular urgency. "You're from the compact," he said, not a question. He had been told to expect contact, apparently. "I am," I said. "Varisol 3rd Diplomatic House. I'm looking for Elias Cormac." "That's me." He pulled off the second glove and tucked both in his back pocket. "Come up to the porch. I'll get water." This was not what I had prepared for. I had prepared for a formal reception, some acknowledgement of the occasion, the weight of what I was here to discuss. I had prepared for the kind of man my brief on Kethari warriors would recognize, bearing, deliberate movements that signal capability, the controlled stillness of someone who has learned that presence is a tool. I had prepared for a warrior. He was walking to his porch to get water. I followed him. He brought 2 cups and a pitcher of water and set them on the porch railing. He poured both cups. He handed me one. He sat in a wooden chair and drank from the other with the ease of a man who drinks water on his porch in the mid-morning as a matter of routine. He was not performing ease. He was simply at ease. This is a distinction I have learned to make over 22 years, and it is not always obvious, but it was obvious here. The chair fit him. The porch fit him. The farm fit him. He was in his place and he knew it completely. Coordinator told me a compact emissary was coming, he said. Didn't say what for. Usually when someone makes that kind of trip out to a working farm, they want something specific. The compact wants to discuss a formal alliance, I said. A bond of mutual honor, against the dominance pact's movement along this corridor. He nodded, not impressed, not alarmed, filed. I was given your name by the settlement coordinator, I said. I should be candid. I expected someone in a different capacity. Your registry lists agricultural occupation. It does, he said. Your service record is sealed. It is. He did not offer to unseal it. He drank his water and looked out across the field he'd been working. I was, at this point, operating on the assumption that I had been misdirected, that the coordinator had made an error, or perhaps a joke in some local register I wasn't equipped to parse. I was calculating how to extract myself gracefully and request a corrected contact. How long have you been on Kethais? I asked. 11 years. And before? He looked at me with a mild expression. Before was before, he said. Now I'm farming. The onions go in this time of year. He said it exactly the way someone says a fact, not defensively, not with warning in it. The onions go in this time of year, the same way you'd say the sun rises in the east. Just a thing that was true, and that he was attending to. I noted this. I did not yet understand what I was noting. We talked through the morning. He was not evasive. He answered my questions about the colony, about the Kethais corridor's recent history from a ground-level view, about what he'd observed of the dominance pact's approach over the last year, supply routes disrupted, a mining cooperative 2 systems over that had quietly stopped filing status reports, the way the corridor's smaller operators were starting to move their operations inward. He was well informed. He used the language of someone who reads thoroughly and retains what matters. He had no apparent emotional investment in any particular outcome from the conversation. He was simply accurate. He did not once perform. He did not lean forward, did not lower his voice for effect, did not arrange himself to suggest that I was in the presence of something formidable. He sat in his chair on his porch and talked to me the way he would talk to anyone who had come with a reasonable question. I kept finding myself recalibrating my expectations and having to deliberately set them aside. My training is extensive, and my 22 years have given me a substantial empirical base. None of my categories were fitting. I was running through them and finding each one slightly wrong. By the time the sun had moved significantly across the sky, I had made my polite case for being shown to a more suitable contact. I said it as diplomatically as my training allowed, that while I respected the coordinator's judgment, the compact was seeking to seat a peer in a bond of mutual honor, and that the designation required a demonstrated martial history of a particular kind, visibly present, legible to the compact's war council. He listened to this without any visible reaction. "You're welcome to find someone else," he said. "I'm not going to argue with your process. I'm not suggesting there's any deficiency." "I know you're not," he said. "It's a reasonable expectation. You came a long way for a specific thing. If I'm not it, I'm not it." He looked at the field. "I've got 2 more rows to finish before it gets too hot. You can stay for lunch if you want, or I can show you back to your transport." I said I would stay for lunch. I'm not certain why I said it. Professional instinct, possibly. Something in the texture of the morning that I wasn't ready to walk away from without understanding. There was also something simpler. I had been doing this work for 22 years, and I had never before sat across from a being that I could not place in any of my categories, and I found that I wanted to understand why. He went back to the field. I sat on the porch and watched him work. The Kethari have a concept, Sarethvel, for which the nearest translation in the compact's common diplomatic register is something like the quietness of the thing that has already decided. It describes the particular stillness of a predator that is not currently hunting, that has nothing to prove, that simply exists in its environment as a settled fact. It is not the stillness of an empty room. It is the stillness of a room that contains something, and the something knows its own weight, and the weight is not in question. I am not certain when I started reading Elias Cormac through the frame of Sareth Vel. I know it happened incrementally over the course of that morning, and that I didn't fully name what I was doing until later. But I sat on that porch and I watched a 63-year-old human in a worn hat plant onions in the mud, and at some point the word settled into my processing like a weight being placed on a balance, and the balance didn't tip. The balance simply registered. He moved without waste, not with the trained precision of a combatant who has spent years disciplining excess motion out of their body, although that was in it too. It was simpler than that. He moved the way something moves when it has a complete and thorough understanding of its own body and of the physical space it occupies, and when neither of those things has ever been a source of uncertainty. Every action had a vector and a purpose and nothing extra. The tool went into the earth at the right depth without him checking. The spacing between plants was consistent without him measuring. His hands knew the work the way hands know work they have done 1,000 times. His hands had done other work too. I could see it in the way the scarring distributed across them. Some of the scarring was from farming. Some of it was not from farming. Farming does not produce the particular patterns I was looking at, and I had enough cross-species medical literacy to know what does. I looked at the layout of the farmstead with different attention. The fields were oriented so that from the porch you could see all of them. The outbuilding sat at an angle that gave a clear line of sight to the access road without appearing to be positioned for that purpose. The fence line was timber locally sourced, I'd thought, but I looked more carefully at where the posts were set and the spacing between them. Functional rather than decorative, I had thought earlier. Looking again, I considered that functional and tactical are not always distinct categories. The post spacing was the kind of spacing that allows certain things and prevents other things. I didn't have enough context to be specific. I noted it. The porch itself was deep enough to be in shadow from a direct sun angle, but open enough to see all approaches to the structure. The chair he'd been sitting in was positioned facing the track. There was a second chair, angled slightly, covering the approach from the east. I am trained to read environments for threat architecture. I sat on that porch and I reread the farmstead and I started to understand that I was sitting inside a design. It was not a compound. It was not fortified. It was a farm genuinely and thoroughly. The soil work was real. The planting was real. The livestock pen contained actual animals making actual livestock sounds. The morning smelled of turned earth and growing things. None of it was performance. But it had been laid out by someone who, when making the 100 small decisions of building a life on a piece of land, had factored in variables that a farmer with no other history would never have considered. The decisions were integrated into the farming decisions seamlessly. You would not notice any of it unless you were looking for it. I had not noticed it on the approach. I sat with this for a while. When he came back for the midday break, I had questions that were different from my morning questions. He noticed. He poured more water and looked at me with a measured expression and waited. "How many systems did you serve in?" I asked. "A few," he said. "The service record is sealed at your request." "It is." "Most records that are sealed because of the nature of the service," I said, "not because of duration." He didn't answer this directly. He drank his water. "I'm going to ask you something, and I'd like you to consider it a genuine question rather than a diplomatic one," I said. "All right. Were you the right contact all along?" He looked at me for a moment with those pale, direct eyes. There was nothing in them that was performing the answer. There was nothing in them that was preparing me for the answer. He just looked at me, the way you look at something when you're deciding whether the moment calls for more than one word. Coordinator thought so, he said. What did the coordinator know that I didn't? He was quiet for a beat, then, probably the broad strokes. That was all he said. He stood up, went to the door of the farmhouse and said, without looking back, "Lunch in 20 minutes. I need to wash up." I used those 20 minutes to access the public-facing portions of Earth's colonial military registry. Not the sealed record, which I had no authority to open, but the general historical classification records that any diplomatic mission could query. I had glanced at these during my briefing and not found them especially illuminating at the time. I found them more illuminating now. I searched the General Service classification attached to Earth's military records from the Corridor campaigns of 40 years ago. The public-facing portion didn't name individuals. It listed unit types, engagement categories, outcome classifications. One unit type appeared in Corridor campaigns with a frequency and an outcome record that the analysis brief had flagged separately. The flag said, "Units of this classification have no recorded engagement outcome of indeterminate or partial." Across 40 years of Corridor history, all engagements involving this unit classification resolved as concluded. The brief did not explain what concluded meant in the human military's taxonomy. I looked it up. It meant finished, definitively, completely, and permanently finished, not ceasefire, not withdrawal, not negotiated terms. The engagement was complete. The situation that had necessitated the engagement no longer existed as a situation. Concluded. I cross-referenced the geographic record attached to the same classification. The unit type had been deployed to 6 corridor systems across its active history. The corridor systems were listed by their standard registry designations. 7 of the 12 systems currently under dominance packed pressure fell in that geographic range. I did not know, from the public record, how many of those engagements Elias Cormac had personally been part of. The record was sealed. What the public record showed was that in each of those 6 systems, in the years when units of his classification were present, the operational situation had moved from active instability to the outcome classification of concluded. The systems were now quiet frontier settlements, agricultural operations, mining cooperatives, transit relay stations. They had been something else before. I held that for a moment, then I closed the registry access. I looked out across the farmstead. Elias Cormac was at the pump by the outbuilding, washing clay from his hands and forearms with the methodical attention of a man who knows how to get things clean. He worked the pump handle in even strokes. The water ran dark at first and then clear. He watched it run clear, satisfied, dried his hands on a cloth hanging from the pump housing, and came back toward the house. Lunch was a soup made from colony-grown vegetables and some kind of grain, with a bread he'd baked that morning. I had not noticed the smell until I stepped inside and found it immediately obvious. The kitchen was functional and organized. Everything had a place and everything was in it. The surfaces were clean. There was a shelf of reference materials on one wall, printed maps, what appeared to be agricultural manuals and planting guides, a few other volumes whose titles I couldn't read from where I sat. The whole space had the quality of a place that is tended rather than merely inhabited. He ate across the table from me and did not seem bothered by the silence. I asked him about the farm's yield projections for the season. He told me. I asked about the colony's general stability. He told me that too, which farmers were expanding, which were struggling, where the colony's infrastructure was overextended, which supply chain dependencies were fragile. He described the colony's situation, the way someone describes something they have thought about carefully, and without any particular anxiety. It was information a settlement administrator would have. It was also information a person collects when they are in the habit of knowing what's around them. Halfway through the meal I said, "The Compact's House Lord gave me a specific mandate. Find a peer, someone who could sit at a table and be understood." He broke a piece of bread and ate it. A bond of mutual honor, I said. We're not asking for a garrison. We're not asking for a fleet commitment. We're asking for a peer relationship that signals to the Dominance Pact that the Compact is not standing alone in this corridor. He looked at his bowl, thought. The Pact reads signals, he said. It does. What kind of signal does the Compact need them to read? I said that the cost of continuing the push has changed. He nodded, he ate. He said nothing for a while, and I had learned enough about him by then to let the silence run rather than filling it. He was thinking, not stalling. There is a difference. I had catalogued it. I've been farming 11 years, he said eventually. That's not a front. I grow food, I raise animals, I know this land, that's the life I'm in. I understand. I'm not interested in being anybody's symbol, he said. It was even unhurried, not a refusal, a condition. The Compact isn't looking for a symbol, I said. It's looking for a fact. He looked at me then with something that shifted very slightly, not surprise exactly. A small recalibration. As though I'd said something that landed closer to the correct frequency than he'd expected from me. He looked at me for a moment with that same direct, unhurried assessment, and I had the distinct impression that he was deciding something. I'll think about it, he said. He finished his soup. You should stay through tomorrow. Cathari don't usually travel this far on 12-hour turnarounds. I stayed. That afternoon he had a fence line on the north side that needed reposting, and he worked while we talked. The work was physical and consistent, and he did it without pause. He drove posts with a heavy mallet, tested their set, moved to the next one. The rhythm of it was unhurried, but the progress was steady. The mallet strokes were exactly the weight needed and no more. He did not take breaks he didn't need. I asked him about the corridor before the Dominance Pact's expansion. He described the prior decade in the corridor with the kind of granular accuracy that comes from attentive long-term observation, which operators had been reliable, which had not, where the infrastructure had been allowed to degrade, which transit arrangements had been maintained on handshake rather than formal agreement and were therefore fragile. And then he said, the Pact's expansion pattern has a specific failure mode. I asked him to describe it. He did between post strikes without any change in register. The Pact's planning cycle was structured around a fixed interval reassessment rhythm. They were disciplined and they were not careless. But the interval was the vulnerability. If the tactical situation moved faster than the cycle, they overcommitted to the primary problem while the secondary problem opened up. He described the specific supply chain geography in 2 of the 3 systems under pressure, the particular infrastructure choke points where overcommitment would manifest. He identified 2 corridors where the Pact's current position could be leveraged, in combination, to produce exactly that overcommitment. I had not seen this analysis in the House's strategic briefing package. I had read the entire package. This analysis was not in it. Where did this come from? I asked. I've been watching them for about 8 months, he said. He hit a post. Checked its angle, moved. They're disciplined. They're not careless, but they don't adapt well when the situation moves faster than their planning cycle. He said it the way he'd told me. The onions go in this time of year. You've been watching them, I said. It's a working farm, he said. Not much else to do in the evenings. A neighbor came by in the late afternoon. I had not seen another property on the access road, but apparently there was one further along. The neighbor was a woman, Earth-human female, perhaps a decade younger than Elia's, with the same kind of outdoor weathering and the same kind of hands. She came up the access road on foot, carrying a sealed container. She left it on the porch railing without knocking, the way someone who has done this before does it, no ceremony, no announcement. She exchanged a few words with Elias. What I caught was her looking at me for a moment directly, with the same flat assessment the settlement coordinator had used. Then she looked at Elias. Something passed between them. not a word. A quality of shared context, a reference to something already understood between two people who have known each other long enough that the reference doesn't need to be stated. She left, he went back to the fence. I asked who she was. Lena, he said. She's got the spread east of here, runs cattle mostly. She seemed to know you well. We've been out here about the same amount of time, he said. Colony this small, you know your neighbors. I watched where he'd put his eyes when she looked at him and then at me. There was nothing evasive in it, just a quiet accounting, her arrival, the container, her direction of departure. He had noted all of it without breaking the rhythm of what he was doing, and he had filed it and moved on. The fence line mattered. He was finishing the fence line. I thought about the coordinator. I thought about the woman with the same kind of hands. I thought about how many people in a colony of this size carried that quality of flat, direct assessment in their gaze as a matter of course, and what that suggested about who colonized the edges of the Kethai's corridor and why. That evening he cooked. He used the container Lena had brought, some kind of preserved protein, along with things from his own stores. The kitchen work had the same economy as everything else he did. No wasted motion, no second guessing, no performance for the guest. He adjusted the seasoning once, tasted it, moved on. He cooked the way someone cooks who has fed themselves reliably in conditions that were not always convenient, who has learned to produce a good result from whatever is available without requiring the ideal. We ate on the porch. The sun was going down and the fields were turning the color of old copper in the late light. The livestock were quiet. The air had cooled and smelled of the turned earth in the field he'd been working. He ate without hurry and didn't talk through the meal. I had stopped finding the silences uncomfortable. They were productive in the way the silences of someone who is thinking are productive, full of weight, going somewhere. After a while I said, I want to ask you something directly. He waited. When you decided to stop, I said, was it because you were finished or because you chose to stop? He was quiet for long enough that I thought he wouldn't answer. I got old, he said. That's not what I asked. Another pause. Both, he said. The work I was doing is work for people who are operating at a certain level. I could still operate, but not the way I was. So it became somebody else's work to do, and I came out here and learned something different. He looked across the fields. Farming's harder than it looks. Is it? I said. Most things worth doing are, he said. It was flat. No self-pity in it, no wisdom performance. Just a statement about a thing he had tested and found true in multiple contexts. I turned it over. If the compact formalized a bond of mutual honor, I said, and you were the named peer, your name on the document, not a fleet action, not a garrison commitment, just your name and what it means, would the Dominance Pact read that correctly? He thought about it. They have analysts, he said. Analysts do their jobs. And if they do their jobs. He was quiet for a moment. The last of the sun was on the far field. The bird song from the hedgerow had gone quiet. They'll do their math, he said, and then they'll do it again. He said it exactly like that. No escalation. No weight applied for effect. Just the flat declarative certainty of a man telling you what 2 and 2 makes. 20 minutes tomorrow morning, he said. Ask me whatever you need to ask. I'll answer what I can. I said that's all I need. He nodded and went inside. I sat on the porch in the cooling air and listened to the farmstead settle around me and thought about the word Sci-F and about what it means when the thing in the room has genuinely stopped caring whether you can read it, and what you do with an assessment when none of your categories fit. The 20 minutes the next morning ran to an hour and a quarter. He didn't expand because I pressed him. He expanded because, once he decided to answer, he answered completely. That was another thing I cataloged. He did not do anything by halves. When he worked, he worked. When he stopped, he stopped. When he chose to answer a question, the answer was whole. I learned the following. He had served 26 years in Earth's military, in a classification that the open records described with the category code used for specialized corridor operations. The specific designation was sealed. He gave me the general shape of it without giving me the designation. Long deployments, small teams, high lethality. Not the kind of work that generates commendations that go in public records, because the kind of work it was did not officially occur in a great many of the places where it occurred. He said this without bitterness and without pride. He said it the way you describe a job you did and understood fully, and are now done with. He had operated in 6 of the 12 corridor systems that the Dominance Pact was currently pressing. 6 systems. He had been in those systems, not passing through, not providing support in a direct operational capacity. He knew the terrain, the infrastructure dependencies, the local species threat assessments, the particular tactical geography of each system in a way that no amount of satellite mapping could replicate. He had been in those systems during periods that were not calm. He had left them in states that were. He had come to Kethai's colony because it was at the edge of the corridor and quiet and had good soil. He had wanted to grow things. He had been very tired. He said this last part without any particular weight on it. He had been very tired. He planted onions now. I asked him, before the hour was out, the direct question. If the Dominance Pact receives the Compact's bond documentation with your name on it, your actual name, your corridor service record unsealed for the purpose, or even just your name and Kethai's colony and the corridor connection, will they read it correctly? He thought about it in the way I had come to recognize. The quiet, thorough way he thought about things he was going to answer accurately. They have analysts, he said again, good ones. They'll run the corridor record. They'll see where I was and what was happening there before I arrived and what was happening after I left. He paused. They'll do the math. And what does the math say? He was quiet. It says the cost went up, he said. Not because I'm still the same thing I was, I'm not. But the math doesn't require me to be. The math just requires them to factor in an unknown they can't fully bound. That's enough. He said it with the same quiet certainty as everything else. Not a threat, a description. I wrote my assessment that morning, sitting at the table where we'd had breakfast, while he went out to the far field. I wrote it carefully, using the Compact's standard threat assessment taxonomy for the first several sections, covering the corridor situation, the Dominance Pact's operational pattern, the strategic case for the Bond Alliance. The final section, the assessment of the proposed peer, the evaluation of whether Elias Cormac constituted what the Compact's House Lord had asked me to find, took me the longest to write. The standard taxonomy has categories for threat classification: active combatant, retired combatant, grade classifications 1 through 7 based on service history and maintained operational capacity, reserve designation, non-combatant. I ran through each category and found that none of them were exactly right. He was not an active combatant, he was farming. He was not a retired combatant in the standard sense of the taxonomy, which assumes a degrade curve. Training maintained at some level, operational capacity reduced from service peak, residual capabilities still present but diminishing. The degrade curve assumes that what a being was at peak is no longer what it is now, and classifies accordingly. I did not believe the degrade curve applied. What I had watched for 36 hours was not a man whose capabilities were diminishing. He was older. He managed a body with accumulated costs. He was not the physical entity he had been at 30. All of that was true, but capability is not only physical. What I had watched was a man in complete possession of everything he had ever learned, with no anxiety about any of it, moving through a world he had assessed thoroughly and found manageable, with the settled calm of something that has not been surprised in a very long time. The question of whether he could still do the things his record described him doing was not one I felt qualified to answer as yes, but reduced. I had watched him for a day and a half, and I could not bound his ceiling. I tried. I considered the scarring, the movement, the analysis of the pack's operational vulnerability, the environmental architecture of the farmstead, the way he had registered the creature in the hedgerow. I could not produce a number. I could not find the upper limit. That is not the same as saying the upper limit is infinite, but it is materially different from finding a reduced ceiling, and the difference matters to the math. Because the math is what the dominance pact would do. The pact would receive the documentation, run the corridor record, find the 6 systems, find the outcome classification, concluded, across 26 years of sealed service, and then find a 63-year-old farmer on the edge of the corridor and try to produce a number. And they would find what I found, that they could not bound the ceiling. That the thing had put itself down, but they could not determine how far down it had gone, or whether down was even the right word for a settled threat that had simply stopped seeing anything in its current environment that required it to be anything other than what it was. I wrote in the final section, Standard Threat Taxonomy Insufficient. Proposed Classification, Category Null beyond Standard Threat Taxonomy. I explained it as follows. The standard taxonomy is calibrated against beings who maintain a legible relationship between their current state and their peak capacity. Elias Cormac presented no such legible relationship. His current state was agricultural. His assessed capacity was not determinable from observation. The sealed service record covered 26 years in a classification with no recorded outcome of anything other than concluded. He had, in the course of a morning conversation, identified 2 operational vulnerabilities in the dominance, PAC's current position, that the Compact's full strategic analysis team had not flagged. He had described the PAC's planning cycle failure mode with the flat accuracy of someone identifying a structural fault in a wall they had looked at 1,000 times. I noted in the assessment the moment I had spent the most time thinking about in the 48 hours since it occurred. During the second afternoon, while we were working along the fence line, a sound came from the far end of the property. Not loud, not close. Something in the brush at the hedgerow, perhaps, or the livestock pen, a sound that was slightly wrong without being obviously alarming. The kind of sound that passes unnoticed by most beings because the alarm threshold isn't reached. He stopped. He stopped mid-sentence, and he went quiet, and he turned his head a degree or two toward the sound, and he was still. Not the careful stillness of someone on alert, something prior to alert, something that happened before the category of threat or no threat had even been assigned, just the pure, immediate, complete attention of a thing that notices. No tension in the body, no change in expression. Simply, presence redirected fully and instantly to the source of the anomaly, while the rest of the farmstead continued exactly as before, while I was still processing whether I had heard something or not. 3 seconds, perhaps 4. Then whatever had made the sound resolved into something ordinary, a burrowing animal in the hedgerow from the sound of it. He turned back to the fence. He finished the sentence. He had not at any point looked alarmed. His expression had not changed. He had simply been, for those 3 or 4 seconds, entirely elsewhere, not distracted, not anxious, but shifted into a quality of attention that I do not have a precise word for in my own language. The Sci-F is the closest I can come. But it is not quite right, because the Sci-F describes a stillness, and what I had seen was not stillness. It was the opposite of stillness. It was the most complete engagement with a stimulus I have ever witnessed in a being that was not visibly reacting to it. Then he came back and finished the sentence. I wrote this into the assessment. I recorded it not as an anecdote but as a data point, with the specific behavioral indicators and the duration. It belongs in the record. It is among the most relevant things I observed. The assessment was transmitted to the 3rd Diplomatic House that morning. A courtesy copy went to the colony's administrative office, as protocol required. I have said what I said about the routing error. I will not repeat it here. The inquiry's findings are in the record. What I know about the PAC's response is what the Compact's liaison office reported to the House in the weeks following my departure. The expansion operations in the Kethai's corridor, specifically the three-system push that had been proceeding with a pace that suggested a fixed timeline, slowed. Not stopped. The PAC does not stop, but the operational tempo reduced. The supply route extensions under construction in 2 of the 3 systems went on to review status. The PAC's regional command filed 2 requests for updated transit corridor information through the standard diplomatic channel. The same 2 corridor systems where Elia's Cormac service record placed him, in the period before the sealing. I do not know what the PAC's analysts concluded. I can only read the operational change. The bond of mutual honor was formalized 6 weeks later. Elias signed through a colony proxy. He was not present. He was, per the colony's administrative office, occupied with the spring planting. The House Lord's formal acknowledgement was delivered to the colony administrative office. It was passed on. I was told by the settlement coordinator, who told me in the same tone he had used when giving me the grid coordinates, the flat, informational tone of a man conveying a fact, that Elias had read it on his porch, put it on the table next to his coffee, and gone back out to the field. I have thought about what to include in this appendix. The formal assessment is complete. The taxonomy is clear. What follows is a personal addendum, which I have chosen to include because I believe it is material to how the document should be read by any subsequent emissary or analyst who needs to understand what category null means in practice, and why the category exists now when it did not before this assignment. I have assessed 417 individuals in my 22 years. I have sat across tables from beings that the standard taxonomy classified in every available range. I have been in the presence of things that were genuinely dangerous and things that performed danger convincingly, and things that were dangerous without being aware of it. I have been in the presence of one category null. It was not the scarring on his hands that I remember most. It was not the layout of the farmstead, the positioning of the outbuilding, the sightlines from the porch. It was not the tactical analysis of the PAC's corridor vulnerabilities, delivered between post strikes without any visible awareness that it was exceptional. It was not the moment at the hedgerow, although that moment belongs in the record and I have put it there. What I remember most is the last morning, when I was sitting at the table writing the assessment and he was outside, and I looked up through the window and he was standing in the far field looking at the sky. Not doing anything, not checking anything, just standing in the field he had been tending for 11 years, looking at the sky the way you look at something you have looked at many times and still find worth looking at. He stood there for perhaps 2 minutes, then he went back to work. I don't know what to do with that memory in an assessment framework. It doesn't fit a category. It is not Sorethvel. It is something quieter than that. It is the image of something that has put itself in a place that fits it, and has found that the place is sufficient, and is present in that sufficiency without any remainder of what it used to be, and without any loss of it either. I finished the assessment, I packed my things, I walked the track to my transport. He walked with me, as he had the first time. The air was cool and the fields were green and the colony's sun was still low over the eastern ridge, and the whole farmstead was lit in the slanted morning light that makes everything look more permanent than it is. At the transport I asked him, I'm not certain why I asked, except that 22 years of diplomatic instinct don't fully turn off, whether there was anything he wanted me to include in the assessment on his behalf. He stood in the dust clearing and looked at me with that direct, mild expression, the hat pulled low against the morning light. Tell them it's a working farm, he said. That's what it is. He turned around and walked back up the track toward the house. He did not look back. I boarded my transport and filed the assessment and departed the Kethai's colony and went on to the next case. 6 weeks later, when I received the notification about the routing error and the Dominance Pact's receipt of the document, I was in a different system entirely, dealing with a trade dispute of a kind that seemed very manageable by comparison. The assessment says what it says. The Dominance Pact read it and did their math. The compact has its bond. The corridor has been quiet for 4 months. I received one further piece of information, 3 months after my visit, from the settlement coordinator. He sent it through the standard diplomatic channel as a brief informational note, the kind of pro forma update a coordinator sometimes sends to close a mission file. The note said that the planting had gone well and the yield projection for the season was favorable. He added at the end one sentence that I do not think was strictly necessary for a routine file closure note. He hasn't changed anything about how he lives. I read that sentence twice. I understood it the same way I had understood the farmstead, and the fence line, and the flat accuracy of everything he had said. The coordinator was telling me something I already knew and was confirming it anyway, in the way that people who have lived alongside something significant sometimes feel the need to say it plainly, even when the plain saying isn't required. Nothing had changed. The document had been filed. The pact had done its math. The bond had been formalized. The corridor had quieted. And Elias Cormac was on his farm, 11 kilometers outside the settlement, doing exactly what he had been doing the morning I arrived and the morning I left and every morning in between for 11 years. Elias Cormac is planting the spring crop. His fence line is maintained. His fields are in good order. The document classifies him as category null beyond standard threat taxonomy, and the document is accurate, and the document is in the record, and none of it required him to do anything except be what he already was. A working farm is what it is. He told me so on the first morning, and I did not understand it then, and I understand it now, and the understanding is the whole of the assessment.